home learning video. The purpose of this recorded PowerPoint is simply to talk you through the final aspects of the Himley Hall unit, as I know some students had completely finished it by the time that you all had to leave school, and some of you had not. So I'm hoping that this PowerPoint will bring us all to the same level. The PowerPoint's going to include the following things. So it's going to look towards the end of the Himley Hall module, starting with the typicality of Himley compared to other manor houses of the time, which in this case is Whitley Court. I appreciate that some of you might have already done this, but I know, for instance, in my group, this had not been covered, as I wasn't in, unfortunately. So hopefully this will clear up the typicality aspect of it. So we'll talk through what this means in a little bit more detail when we get to that slide. We're also going to look at some exam questions that you might end up having to discuss in your exam for Himley Hall. So one of these questions might be what Himley Hall can reveal about everyday life, attitudes and values in particular periods of history. So we'll have a look through each of those periods to answer those questions. You could be asked about what historical inquiries you could make about Himley Hall, and we'll look at some routes of questions that you could have a look for that one. You could also be asked how the physical remains inform artistic reconstructions and other interpretations of the site, what the challenges and benefits of studying Himley Hall are, and then lastly, I'm going to provide you with an overview of the exam, so what the exam will look like and how it is structured and what you can expect from it. And then finally, we're going to look at how to actually answer one of the exam questions, and we'll plan that answer together so that you've got a feel for what you need to do when you come to write your exam. All of this will hopefully help you, because when you come back to school, you will be having an in-class mock exam on Himley Hall, so it's really important that you use this along with the other resources that we've sent you, such as the quiz and the physical features revision sheet, as well as your booklet as well. That contains all of your work in it that you've done so far this term. It's really important that you use all of that in order to best prepare for when you come back, as you'll have to go straight into that mock exam, unfortunately, due to the lost time. So without further ado, let's get started. Towards the end of the module, some classes will have already covered this, so if you have, feel free to skip forward through the video, but I know some of mine didn't cover this. A big part of this particular topic is looking at how typical our site, Himley, is compared to other manor houses of the time. Now, you could be asked how typical Himley is. When I say typical, I mean what is similar about Himley compared to Whitley Court, which is the chosen site of comparison, and what is different about Himley compared to Whitley Court. Now, when I'm talking about similarities and differences, I of course mean in terms of physical features. You are going to need to know the physical features of Whitley Court so that you can make accurate comparisons in terms of similarities and differences with the physical features of Himley that you've been studying in the booklet since the start of the unit. You can also talk about the similarities and differences in terms of the purpose and the uses of the two sites as well. But you must include some discussion of the physical features in every single paragraph of your answer, otherwise you will not be able to access the mark scheme. There's a picture of Whitley Court. We'll talk about that on the next slide in a little bit more detail, but you can already see straight away from the picture that there are lots of differences as well as some similarities between Himley and Whitley. You have information about Whitley Court in your booklets on page 11. This is very detailed. I strongly suggest, if you have not already read this in class, that you read through that particular page, and whilst you are reading through that page of information on the physical features and the uses and the owners and the key events of Whitley Court, I suggest in one colour you highlight anything similar between Whitley and Himley in one colour, and then in another colour you highlight any differences that you notice between Whitley Court and Himley. And then once you have got those highlighted similarities and differences, if you turn over your page onto page 12, you'll be able to see that there is a table for you to condense those into bullet point notes that make it nice and easy for your revision. I just want to talk about that on this slide for those of you in my classes that didn't cover this with me, just so that you've got it. Again, if you have gone over this with your teacher in class, feel free to skip through it, although it will be covering some revision on this typicality in case you wanted it. So on the left, you can see those two pictures of the comparisons. Like I said, you can clearly see that there are lots of similarities in the structure and the physical features, but equally they are very unique and distinct in their own right. However, we're going to start off with the similarities, so what is similar between Whitley Court and Himley Hall. First up, they're both similar properties, okay? their use is very similar in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They are both considered one of the great country houses of England at this particular time. They both sort of reached their peak in the peak of grandeur in the Victorian era. And Whitley Court is the setting of many extravagant parties and royal entertainment, which is very similar to Himley Hall, as you already know. As Edward VIII, the king, and his wife Wallis Simpson visit Himley, okay, Whitley also sees lots of famous, powerful, and extravagant guests visit it. For more information of that, please go to page 11 in your booklet. You also get the fact that the first Baron Foley in 1670, who owned the property, between 1673 and 1733 in Whitley Court, he enlarges Whitley Court with wings, just like Himley Hall, as you can see in that picture, has wings as well. In the mid-18th century, Whitley Court has something called the front pool added to it by damming one of the brooks that by damming the water, that feeds the brook. This is very similar to the Great Lake that is at the front of Himley Hall that's introduced by Lancelot Capability Brown. So they both have very extravagant and decorative water features that are a big part of the property. They both have Georgian interiors. On the Himley Hall, you have the Georgian sash windows, and on the inside of Whitley Court, before it was gutted by the fire, it had a Georgian interior design. They both have very ornate formal gardens. So in the 1850s, William Andrew Nesfield is the sort of leading landscape designer of his day. He designed the ornate formal gardens that you can see in the picture at the top in Whitley Court, and that's very much like Lancelot Capability Brown, who transforms the landscape of Himley, with his planting of scattered clumps of trees, and of course the Great Lake. Okay, so they both have very similar ornate formal gardens by leading landscape designers. Those landscape designers are different. At Whitley, it's William Andrews Nesfield, and at Himley, it's Capability Brown. They both have a fire as well. However, there is a difference because Himley is restored. However, as you can just about make out in this top picture in Whitley Court is gutted as a result of the fire. Okay, it destroys the property and it's not rebuilt. However, it is a similarity that they do both have a fire. Now, the difference is, as you can probably tell, this top picture of Whitley makes Whitley look much more opulent than Himley. When I say opulent, I mean it looks much more extravagant, much more fancy than Himley, but that's the word that we'd like you to use. It's much more opulent in its appearance. Another difference is the fact that in the 1850s in Whitley, the Earl of Dudley, who owns it at the time, brings in a leading architect called Samuel Dawkes, and he recasts the austere exterior of Whitley Court in what is called a Bath stone, and that's done in an Italianate style. Now, yes, Himley does also have a leading architect work on it called William Atkinson, as you can remember. However, the styles of these leading architects are very different. Whitley is covered in Bath stone in an Italianate style, and Himley is covered in Atkinson cement, and that is in a Palladian style. So that's quite a big difference in the physical features of the two places. You also get the fact that in Whitley Court they have the new curving wing added at the southwest corner. The curving wing is this bit here. You can see it curving round and it leads round into this bit. This curving wing is covered in a glass roof to make it like a large conservatory, and of course Himley Hall does not have one of those. Okay, so that's another difference in the physical features. You also get the fact that in Whitley Court the Georgian interiors are replaced by ornate decorations in Louis XV style. However, Himley Hall does not replace its Georgian interiors. In fact, they remain sort of intact there, so they keep the Georgian style, whereas at Whitley Court they replace it with ornate decorations in the style of Louis XV. You also get the fact that after the fire in 1937 that destroys Whitley Court, they do not bother to rebuild it. Sir Herbert Smith, the owner at the time, decides not to rebuild it, and instead he puts the estate up for sale, whereas we know at Himley, when there is a fire under the coal board, they do partially rebuild it. Yes, they don't. They do cover up one of the staircases, but Himley Hall still very much has an interior and a function today, whereas Whitley Court is just a shell of a building and a bit of a tourist site, okay? But there is nothing inside Whitley Court, whereas obviously there is lots inside Himley. So that is another difference. In summary then, there are lots of similarities and differences that you can talk about between Himley Hall and Whitley Court. Just to reiterate, you must, when you are talking about the typicality, make sure that you are comparing physical features. If you are talking about the purpose of the two places, you must have physical features to back those up. However, we are going to plan an answer together for a typicality question at the end of this video. So, moving away from typicality then, another particular question that you could get might ask you the following. If you have a look at the top of the screen, it says, what could Himley Hall reveal about everyday life, attitudes and values in particular periods of history? So for this one, I have broken down each period into sort of key moments that reveal something about everyday life, attitudes and values for that particular time. The Himley Hall, the site, gives us a great insight into what people considered important and what life was like for those people who owned the house at that particular time. So if we look at the top, it says prior to 1740s, that's our first time period. Now, as I'm sure we can all remember, Himley Hall in this time period is a moated manor house. It stands next to a medieval church and village, and for over 4 centuries it serves as a home to the Lords of Dudley and their knights. Now, what you have to ask is, well, what can this reveal about life at the time? So the fact that it's a moated manor house, it stands next to a medieval village, and it serves as a home for the Lords of Dudley and their knights, well, it can reveal to us that large houses of residence at this particular time prior to 1740 are designed to protect in case of attack. Their main purpose, as we've talked about lots in this unit of study, their main purpose in this time period is a house of residence. They're not a castle, they're not meant for attacking and sieging, but they are designed to protect in case of attack, because at the time there is lots of turmoil, lots of violence with the English Civil War going on. And of course you get Charles I in camp in the grounds of Himley on his way to defeat the Battle of Naseby. So what else can we learn about everyday life, attitudes and values in particular periods of history prior to 1740, because of Himley Hall? Well, because Himley was a manor house for the Earls of Dudley, and the house provided a central position on the estate, which included coal mines and steelworks, we can reveal that, or understand, that it's important for the home to be near the means of production for the workers. Clearly, at the time, with the Earls of Dudley, considered it important for their home to be near the means of production for the workers, due to the fact that the estate included these coal mines and steelworks. The next time period then, so 1740 to 1850, we've got the fact that John Ward, who is the 6th, that should say Lord Ward, not Lord Ward, Lord Ward, inherits the Himley estates. At the same time, he's elected as an MP, so a Member of Parliament. His new high status position called for a more impressive home to reflect this. Well, due to the fact that he demolishes Himley Hall as it stood in the prior to 1740 period and completely rebuilds it, what can this reveal about attitudes and values of important people like MPs at the time? Well, it can reveal that homes of powerful people at this time were designed to impress and be a symbol of their status. Moreover, by the 18th century, we know that the aristocracy preferred a wide area of parkland around their stately homes. Himley Village, as a consequence of this, was relocated, and it was finally completed when the church was erected on its present site, so where it currently stands, in 1764. So what can this reveal to us about attitudes and values of estate owners at the time? Well, it reveals to us that there is a desire now to be more isolated from the workers and not to live at the centre of the production. Prior to 1740, we had the fact that the Earl of Dudley liked the fact that his estate had the coal mines and the steelworks, because at the time it was an important attitude and value that the home be near the means of production for the workers. However, by the 18th century, these attitudes and values have changed. It's no longer desirable to be living next to the workers and the means of production. And by the 18th century, these attitudes and values have changed. And this is reflected in Himley Hall and the changes that happen on the estate. Lastly, for this time period then, the first Earl of Dudley, so that's John William Ward, as we know, brings in the famous London architect William Atkinson, who brings in lots of new and expensive features. The hall we see today is mainly a result of William Atkinson's work. Well, what does this reveal to us about the attitudes of the time, the fact that this famous architect, is brought in? Well, it reveals to us that in this time period, 1740 to 1850, because of the Earl's growing status and the fact that he becomes Foreign Secretary, which is a very important cabinet position, as well as the fact that he's now very rich because of this job, he has the ability to afford the very best to make his home reflective of his position. So just like at the start of this period, we can learn about the values of the time of those who own the home, the fact that if you had this high paid, well established job, you wanted your home to reflect that. That was an important attitude for this time period, an important value. For the last time period then, obviously, as you know, there are lots of changes that occur before World War II, so between 1900 and the 1940s. The fact that you get the gardens, the swimming pool, the cocktail bar is added along with the shoot as well, and the Chinese room with the £400 wallpaper and the lacquered furniture, and the fact that a cinema room with a talkie, so a speaking cinema, is all created before 1940. Well, what do all of these changes reveal to us about the attitudes of the early 1900s of estate owners? Well, it reveals to us that the Earls of Dudley clearly wanted to impress their famous visitors. So, for example, Winston Churchill, Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson, and their workers through how their hall looks. So it's important for people in the 1900s to impress their famous visitors, and this reveals the values and attitudes of the time. Second, during the Second World War, the fact that the hall served as a health centre for the Red Cross, treating badly injured pilots, well, this reveals to us that during the war, it was now, the values had now shifted, because it was no longer just to impress the famous visitors. It shows that now the hall was, the values of the hall had changed, and it was to meet the needs of the country, not just the rich owners. It was now serving a practical purpose, helping those badly injured pilots. Following 1941, all of the usage of Himley has been practical. For example, as we just discussed, World War II. However, you also get practical use as just after the war in 1947, the hall is auctioned off to the coal board and then the council. Well, what does this reveal to us about everyday life, attitudes and values in this particular period after 1940? Well, it shows us that the hall changed to a practical purpose due to the changing situation of the time. So as everyday life had changed throughout this period, so had the attitudes and values of the time, and this is reflected in the hall. The fact that the hall becomes a headquarters for the coal board, and then later when the council own it, it becomes student accommodation. And then lastly, in 1992, Dudley began phased work on a phased programme of restoration through financial support from the European Regional Development Fund. Well, what does this reveal to us then about everyday life attitudes and values in the 1990s? Well, it shows us that now there is clearly an aim to raise money to ensure that the hall did not fall into disrepair like Whitley Court did, as you had seen on the other side. Okay, so there is lots and lots of information here that we have about the hall and what the hall can tell us about these three things at the top. Okay, so the hall is almost like a microcosm for the wider world. It reveals to us how the world around it is changing. You could also be asked what historical inquiries you could make about Himley Hall. Now, I'm not going to read through all of these because you have this in your booklet, but just have a look through some of the strands of questions that you could particularly ask about it, or that could be asked of you about it. So who it was built, who changed it, who used it, what is it? All of this should be familiar to you from your revision, but I do encourage you to look over your notes again and see if you can answer the strands of these questions as you are going through. So look out for these. Okay, and if you weren't sure already, a historical inquiry is like an investigation that you could do about Himley Hall to find out more information. Okay. You could also be asked how the physical remains of Himley Hall inform artistic reconstructions and other interpretations of the site. This is a little bit of a wordy question. What we mean by this is, based on how Himley Hall physically looks today, what physically remains of Himley Hall from when it was first built, how could this inform artistic reconstructions of what Himley might have looked like in previous periods and other interpretations of the site? So those old pictures that you have seen of Himley, for example, from the prior to 1740 period with its moated manor house and the drawbridge and the turrets, these are all artistic reconstructions and interpretations that have been gathered from what we know about the site. So because Himley Hall's exterior and grounds are all in good condition, and the grounds are fully functioning with the Great Lake, etc., this would allow artists to reconstruct what the hall looks like. It is not like Whitley Court that has been completely gutted and destroyed, which makes it very difficult to imagine without the use of photographic evidence what Whitley looked like. Himley is in very good condition, and lots of the features that have been introduced throughout its history, for example, like the Great Lake, still exist today, which means it's much easier for us to create artistic reconstructions and interpretations of the site. You've also got the fact that, as mentioned before, when Dudley Council began the phased programme of restoration in 1992, the fact that you get 8 rooms within the historic core of Hull were restored to their former glory, this would allow artistic reconstructions to be produced. So because Dudley Council in the 1990s redesign 8 rooms within the hall to try and make them look like they did historically, to restore them to the former glory, this allows accurate artistic reconstructions to be produced. Okay, so see, these are some of the things that you could talk about and consider for that question. You must also consider what the challenges and benefits of studying Himley Hall are. So if we start with the benefits to begin with, due to the high quality remains of Himley Hall, you can get a real sense of what it was like. And you also get the ability to see real history due to those physical remains that we just talked about on the previous slide. You also get the fact that another benefit of studying Himley Hall is that local students, like yourselves, can learn more about your local area and the importance of it and what role this local area has played in history throughout time. You also get the fact that it creates a sense of pride and significance for the area and for the local people. Many of you were quite shocked to discover that Charles I, a King of England, had encamped so close to the school on the grounds of Himley Hall, and this is important. It's a real benefit of studying Himley Hall because it creates that sense of pride. It gives you an idea of the history and your place in it within this local area. However, of course, there are some challenges to studying Himley Hall. The fact that you could get different interpretations of the same site over time. So because some aspects of Himley have changed quite significantly, and because we do not have the Himley Hall that we had in the prior to 1740 period, we only have some documentary evidence. It means that different people might interpret and imagine the site to have looked in different ways. You also get the fact that the significance of the area may be exaggerated. Yes, there was lots occurring at Himley at different points, but for large parts of its history, there also wasn't very much happening. Okay, so we are looking at the bigger picture, and we're just picking out those key changes. So it does run the risk of perhaps exaggerating the significance of the area somewhat. And then lastly, as I mentioned earlier, because of a lack of written sources on the history of Himley Hall, it does give us limited interpretations of the past. Historians can only work with the evidence that they have, and the rest they kind of have to make informed guesses of. Because, like I said, Himley Hall doesn't exist in the same capacity as it did before, it does mean that we have very limited interpretations, and we can only sort of imagine what Himley looked like to a certain degree. Now, the exam itself, what is it going to look like? So when you come back into school and you open your mock exam, what can you expect to find, and how will it work? Well, it's a 1-hour exam. It's the shortest exam that you will sit for history. And I roughly would recommend that you spend your time doing the following things. I recommend at the start you spend about 5 minutes planning, just to make sure that you are including any physical features. I suggest you make a little plan at the top of your answer booklet of what physical features and what time periods those match up to, and that you are double checking and breaking down that question. When you read the question, get your highlighter out and look at what it is specifically asking you. Is it asking you for a particular period? Is it asking you for physical features? Is it asking you about typicality, about change, about challenge, benefits? Highlight those key buzzwords in that question. I then recommend, you'll have to answer 2 questions. I recommend that you spend about 25 minutes on each question. Okay, so you've got your 5 minutes planning, then you'll have about 50 minutes in total answering the 2 questions, and then I suggest you spend about 5 minutes checking. Remember, there are 10 spag marks in total, spelling and grammar marks, 5 on each question. You must make sure that you are spelling key terminology, all of those key buzzwords of physical features that we've talked about correctly. Make sure you are including capital letters when you are talking about the people or some of the key events that occurred at Himley Hall. Make sure you are spelling Himley Hall and Whitley Court with capital letters. These are the easiest marks you will ever get on an exam. Please do not throw them away. Now, when you open it up, there will be a choice of 3 questions. You must only answer 2. Do not bother answering 3. Okay, you must only answer the 2 questions because you will only have time to answer 2 questions properly. Okay, don't even try and attempt to answer 3 because it is a waste of time. You must try and spend as much time as you can on the 2 questions that you've picked. Now, when you are considering which 2 of the 3 questions that you will answer, think very carefully about them. You must remember that this exam paper has been sent out to every school who is doing the same exam board, OCRB, as us. However, not every student across the country will have studied Himley Hall. They will have studied a site that is specific to their local area. Now, as such, the questions are much more generic for this paper, as they must cover all sites across the country. Therefore, some questions will be much easier to answer for Himley Hall than they would for others, whereas other questions might be much more easily answerable for other sites across the country. Okay, so think very carefully about what we have talked about with Himley Hall and which questions best match up to that. So pick the right ones. Now, in every answer, so in every paragraph, in every answer, you must include a discussion and examples of physical features. It is no good just talking about purpose, key events, key people without mentioning those physical features. That is why we are studying Himley Hall. We have looked at how it has physically changed in each time period, and that is why on that first overview page in your booklets, you have bullet pointed at, first of all, the physical features and the people and the events that have gone along with this. However, you must also consider more than just this, so don't just list them. So don't just put bullet point 1, Himley prior to 1740 had a moated manor house, drawbridge and turrets, and then just bullet point them off like that. You must make sure that when you are using the physical features, you are using them to actually answer what the question is asking you. It's not just, the question is not just going to ask you to describe how Himley has changed or what it looks like, but you must use those physical features as evidence to answer whatever the question is asking you. So, how could you actually answer one of the questions? Well, these couple of slides are going to talk you through how you could specifically answer one of the questions. So, if you have a look in the middle here, I have an example question that you might find when you come to do your exam. So, if you have a read of the question, it says, choose one period in the history of your site. How far do you think your site was a typical example of its type at this time? Use physical features of the site as well as your own knowledge to support your answer. Now you will notice I have already highlighted the key features in this question. It's asking you to choose one period in the history of your site. It's not asking you to give the entire history of the site, just one specific period. So think about those 3 time periods that we've been looking at for Himley Hall and which you would pick for this. Then it says, how far do you think your site was a typical example of its time? Well, you see that this question is about typicality, so you immediately must be thinking, right, well, I need to know which site I am going to compare Himley Hall to in order to determine how similar and different Himley Hall was to other types of sites at its time. And then lastly, it says, use physical features of the site as well as your own knowledge. As I said before, you must be including examples of physical features to back up your argument as to whether Himley Hall was typical or not. Okay, so think about which house you will be comparing to. We already know that this is Whitley Court. Think about which time period you could select. Okay, so which of your time periods would be best to compare Himley and Whitley to? And then again, as you know, the physical features. So what physical features in your mind could you be thinking about that you could say, right, well, this is similar between Whitley and Himley. This is different about Himley and Whitley. Now, whichever question you select, so it doesn't matter whether it's a typicality question, it doesn't matter what type of question it is, your layout is the exact same no matter what kind of question you get. This is just one example of a question. However, no matter what question you pick, this is the structure that you must use. Give a 1-sentence introduction, just stating your view. You do not need to write an entire full 4 or 5 sentence paragraph for your introduction. It's a waste of time. Just state what your view is and what you will be arguing in the essay in a sentence. You then need to do 3 Peel paragraphs. So don't forget what Peel means: point, evidence, explanation, link. And when you are talking in each of these Peel paragraphs, you need to make sure that your examples, your physical features, excuse me, actually link back to the question that you are answering. Don't just list the physical features off. Make sure that you are using the physical features to actually answer what the question is asking you. Now, If you think back to your Crime and Punishment and your Nazi Germany and your Elizabeth 18-mark questions and 20-mark questions for Elizabeth, the big ones, you know that you need to do an element of balance. So you need to balance the questions. However, for Himley, that is not the case. You do not need to have a balanced argument in the Himley Himley Hall exam, You could put forward three examples that either agree or disagree with the question, and that would be fine. You could, though, if you wanted to, perhaps provide two examples, for example, of how Himley was typical, and one example of how it was not typical. Or, like I said, if you wanted to, you could do three examples to agree that Himley is typical, or you could do none. You could do three that suggest Himley is not a typical site for its time period. It's completely up to you, but you do not need to do a balanced one. What you do need to do, though, is make sure that you are writing 3 Peel paragraphs after your introduction. Now, like I've said a million times, you must ensure that each of these Peel paragraphs has a physical feature in it. This will be your evidence and your explanation part of that paragraph. If they ask you for a specific time period, you must state in your introduction or your opening sentences which time period that you will be using. State explicitly in the time period prior to 1740, in the time period 1740 to 1850. Don't just leave it for the examiner to guess which time period you are on about, because if you then start to change your time periods, it will immediately mean that you won't be able to pick up the marks for it because you're jumping between them. Make sure if it's asking you for one time period, you state what it is, you stick to it, you write it down, that way you won't forget it either. Once you have finished your 3 paragraphs, provide a short judgment, so a short conclusion. It doesn't need to be reams and reams and reams. Just summarise your argument and your evidence that has backed up that argument throughout. Now, if we take that example question that was here, and I've stuck it at the top here, okay, so let's remind ourselves of it. Choose one period in the history of site. How far do you think your site was a typical example of its type at this time? Use physical features of the site as well as your own knowledge to support your answer. So what we're going to do here is I am going to give you 3 example Peel paragraphs that you could include. It will discuss the Whitley side of it, because don't forget you have to, when you are talking about typicality, include the physical features of Whitley in order to make a comparison of whether Himley is similar or different and therefore typical. So, if I was to write an example introduction for this, I would possibly say something along these lines. Don't forget, you can argue whichever you want as long as you back it up. So, I might say something along the lines of, it's fairly typical for a manor house of the time due to the fact that it has a desire to impress in the period 1740 to 1850, but there were some differences in design. So straight away I'm saying, right, well, it's fairly typical, my site is fairly typical for manor houses of the time because it has a desire to impress like other manor houses of the time. And I've specifically mentioned what time I'm talking about, 1740 to 1850, because there are lots of things that you can compare between Whitley and Himley in this time period. However, I have said that even though they have a similar purpose, their purpose to impress, there were some differences in how they achieved this through the design. So that's my introduction. It doesn't really need to be much longer than that. Obviously, you would put this into a bit of a full sentence, but I've just sort of bullet pointed it here. Now, I might start off my first paragraph by saying the following thing. On the one hand, Himley is not typical of manor houses at the time. That's my point. Straight away, I'm saying Himley is not typical in this first paragraph. That's my point. Now I need some evidence to back that up. So, in the 1850s, Whitley Court reached its peak of grandeur when Ward, now First Earl of Dudley, commissioned the architect Samuel Dawkes to remodel it. It involved recasting the austere exterior in Bath stone in the ornate Italianate style used for the creation of Osborne House on the Isle of Wight for Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. So here I've said Himley is not typical, but what I am doing is providing some physical features of Whitley Court, my comparison site, in order to suggest that, Himley is not typical. Now, what you now need to do, after you've talked about the physical features and given the evidence of Whitley, you need to provide some evidence from Himley Hall that is different, that shows us a difference in the physical features of Himley. So how could you argue that this, the fact that it has the Bath stone and the Italianate style, how could we argue that this shows that Himley is not typical of sites of its time? Well, the fact that William Atkinson, the architect, the different architect, covers Himley Hall in Atkinson cement, not the Bath stone that Samuel Dawkes used. And it's a different style. It's a Palladian style for Himley Hall, not the Italianate style. So this is my first example of how physically Himley is not a typical manor house of its time, okay? And then I would link that back by saying, therefore, this shows that Himley was not typical due to differences in the architectural design. That would be my first paragraph. Then I'd move on to my second, and I might say something like, well, however, it could be argued that Himley is a typical manor house of the time period 1740 to 1850. So again, I'm sticking to that time period. In the mid-18th century, the lake known as the Front Pool was created to the north of the house. So this is for Whitley Court. So perhaps you should suggest here, obviously I haven't included this, so this is an error on my part, but you must state that this is for Whitley Court. So in the mid-18th century, the lake known as the Front Pool at Whitley Court was created to the north of the house by damming the brook that feeds it. Now, how could we argue that this makes Himley typical of manor houses of the time? Well, we know that Himley Hall also had a water feature on the estate, just like Whitley Court did. However, Himley's was called the Great Lake, and it was created by Lancelot Capability Brown rather than William Andrews Nesfield. Okay, so the fact that they both have water features shows that perhaps Himley is typical of manor houses of the time because they have the same water feature. I could then go on to say in my third paragraph, well, another example of how Himley Hall is typical of manor houses of the time period 1740 to 1850, again sticking to that same time period, I'm not jumping about, is the fact that at Whitley, the Earl of Dudley's fortune also funded the creation of an ornate formal garden at Whitley, designed in the 1850s by William Andrew Nesfield, the then leading garden designer of his day. And it shows that the gardens are very clearly important at both Himley and Whitley. Now, again, this isn't perfectly written, okay? I've bullet pointed these to fit it onto the slide. You would do this in a proper paragraph. But here we are talking about, well, also another physical feature that is similar between Himley and Whitley is the fact that in this time period, Whitley, under William Nesfield, the landscape designer, gets a nice ornate formal garden. Okay, so how could we argue this makes Himley similar? Well, it's similar to the beautiful gardens created by Lancelot Capability Brown when he plants the scattered clumps of trees throughout the estate. So here we are providing another example of how Himley and Whitley are very similar in terms of their physical features. Therefore, Himley is typical. You must make sure that you are linking this back to the typicality. Don't just say, oh, they had the same features, end of. You must say, well, that shows us that Himley is therefore typical, a typical example of its type at the time, okay? And then to wrap this up, you just do an overall comment. So you would turn this at the bottom where it says fairly typical into a short conclusion, okay? Just summarising your argument and the evidence that you've put forward for that. Now, as you can see, I've done two examples here that support the idea it is typical and picked two examples that back this up in terms of similarities, and I've done one that suggests, well, actually, perhaps there were some differences, therefore Himley is not that typical. You could have done three similarities to show that it was typical. You could equally have done three differences between Whitley and Himley to show that it was not typical. It is your choice. I have just done a balanced one to show you both sides here, but it is completely up to you. Okay, now that summarizes this video. I hope you found it useful. Best of luck for your mock exam. Please make use of the quizzes and the physical features sheet and your booklets that we have provided for you. If you are missing any answer pages for that, or any of the resources don't work, or you're missing anything, please do email your class teacher and they will be happy to send them over to you. Likewise, if you have any questions about what you need to do in preparation for the exam, if you have any questions that have arisen during you watching this video, please email your class teacher and we'll be happy to help, okay? Bottom line is, use those booklets, revise the physical features, the key people, the key events, and you will be absolutely fine. I have every confidence in you that you are going to smash this, okay? So thank you for watching the video. Again, if you have any questions, please do get in touch with us. Thank you.